Hey everyone, Nick Raboy here. We're going to see how to create a very simple game using Vue.js, Node.js, and Socket.io. And the reason why we're using Socket.io is because we don't want to use REST APIs or GraphQL APIs because we need real-time data, and that's pretty much only deliverable over sockets. So that's why we're using Socket.io. In this game, this isn't really going to be a very hardcore game. It's more or less going to be rendering 2D objects using an HTML canvas and interacting with them through various clients and the server. So there will be multiple components involved in this particular tutorial. We're going to start with the server component, and then we're going to move our way into the Vue.js client component. So I do have my project open. I just have a new directory. It's empty right now. I have my terminal up. But what we're going to do is we're going to run the following command. So I'm going to say make directory, and I'm going to say server. This is going to be my server code. Everything inside that is going to be related to the server side of things. So I'm going to navigate into it, and I'm going to say npm init-y. And that's going to create a package.json file within my server. I'm also going to do a few more things. For one, I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call it app.js. If you don't have that touch command inside of your operating system, just go ahead and create that app.js file manually. It doesn't really matter. This was just more or less a convenience. So I have my file. Finally, what I want to do is I want to include a few dependencies, so a few packages. So I'm going to say npm install. I'm going to say that I want Express framework, and then I'm going to install Socket.io as well. So Socket.io is going to use Express. We're not going to be using Express for REST. We're going to be using Express just for the sole purpose of serving something, so that way Socket.io can do its socket magic. So I'm going to say save. One more package that I'm going to install, and this is just for convenience. It's not necessary towards the project, but I'm going to say npm install nodemon, and I'm going to say save dev as a development dependency. And this will allow us to hot reload any changes that we make to our server without having to manually do it. So I need to configure nodemon. So I'm inside my package.json file. What I want to do is I want to say I want to add a script. I'm going to call it start. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say nodemon app.js. So it's going to watch that app.js file. So I can go ahead and close this package.json file. I'm going to clear my terminal. Again, we're going to focus on everything inside the server component first, and then we're going to work our way into the Vue.js component. So I'm going to open up that app.js file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say constant express equals require express. I'm going to say constant HTTP require HTTP. And although HTTP is part of Node.js, we need it for the configuration process of Socket.io. So I'm going to say require HTTP. I'm going to say server. I'm going to say express, which is what we had just added up on line 1. And actually what I wanted to do is I want to just use the constructor method as well, save us some space. So it's the same thing as saying if typically you might have seen it like this, var app equals express. We're just kind of shortcutting it so that way we don't have to do that. So server express. Third line, I'm going to include Socket.io, so I'm going to say constant. I'm just going to say Socket.io without the dot. Again, you can call these whatever you want. Don't take my word for it. What's really important is what's inside that require. But we're going to say require. We're going to say Socket.io, and we're going to say we want to pass in HTTP. So we have everything included now. We do want to start serving our application, so this would be similar to what we do in a standard Express framework application. We would say HTTP. We would say we want to listen on a particular port. In this case, I'm going to say port 3000. And when we start listening, I'm just going to say, you know what, console.log listening at 3000. So that way we know that it's actually doing something when we run the application. So far, so good. So let's go ahead and do another thing. So this is going to be a very basic game in the sense that, you know what, we're just going to have a square moving around on the screen. We're not going to calculate hit points for any of our players. We're not going to calculate score. We're not going to calculate any of that. All of that could be very easily added to our game. We're just kind of laying down the foundation of our game. So for that purpose, we're only going to be tracking a position of a player. Instead of using a database, which you probably would in a production scenario, we're going to store our positions, our player's position server side. So we're actually going to store it in memory. So when the server restarts or terminates, so does all of our data. But that's fine for this example. But what I'm going to say is I'm going to say var position equals, and this is going to be an object. And all it's really going to do is it's going to store the x and y values. So I'm going to start it at 200 for x, and I'm going to say that y is also going to be 200. And the whole logic behind what's going to happen here is we have our client, which is going to be Vue. The client is never going to be in control of the position of our player. It's all going to be determined server side. So the server is going to broadcast the position to all the players, and basically all of the clients are just going to display that position on the screen. When we want to move the player around, the client is going to make requests to the server, and then the server is going to change the position. So we're never really going to make any direct changes from the client level. It's all going to be dependent on this server, and that really long term, it really depends on the game, I guess. But it does help deter cheating, because then if the player starts determining the position and then sending that to the server, well, then how do you know that the player hasn't spoofed that position, so that way it gives them an advantage, or spoofed any items that they have, or etc. So we're going to let the server handle all of that. So we're going to do one more thing, and then we're going to take a break from the server component, and we're going to go into the Vue.js component. So we're not going to finish the server component quite yet, because I kind of want to show you what it looks like as we go along. So I'm going to go on line 10. I'm going to say socket io.on, and I'm going to listen for a particular event. So I'm going to say connection socket, and we're going to say that. So connection is a reserved kind of label for messages. So this is every time a client socket connects to the server, it's going to trigger this event. So what we can do is we can say, you know what, socket.emit, and we're going to say position, and we're going to say position as in this variable position on line 5. So what we're doing is we're saying socket connects, then we're going to emit a message to that particular socket, so the one that had just connected. We're going to label that message position. It can be labeled whatever we want as long as it's not a reserved label. And that particular message is going to contain the x and y value position. So that's what we're going to do so far. And we're going to take a break. We're going to go into the Vue.js side of things now, so that way we can get the ball rolling. So using the terminal, assuming that you have the Vue CLI installed, we're going to go back a directory. We don't want to be inside of our server directory. We're going to go back a directory to the root, and we're going to execute the Vue create, and we're going to call it client. This is just the project name. Client and server make the most sense, so we're going to call it client. When asked, go ahead and choose the default, and it'll take a second to install everything. All right, so with that installed, let's go ahead and we're at the root in our terminal. Let's go ahead and clear it. What I'm going to do is if you're using Visual Studio Code, go ahead and maybe do a split pane, so that way we have two different terminals. I'm going to use one terminal as soon as it fixes itself here. We're going to do a split pane, so that way one of these terminals we can navigate into the server project, and the other one we can navigate into the client project. I mean, again, it's really up to you. This is just going to save us some time. But in the server, let's just go ahead and say npm run start, because we had created a nodemon script using, so that way it'll automatically watch our app.js file. And then inside of the client terminal, what we want to do is we want to install socket.io as well, because these are two different projects, so we need socket.io as part of both of them. So we're going to say npm install socket.io, and we're going to say -- save. So we have the dependency installed. Now we can go into our Explorer, and what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to remove the Git directory, so that way it doesn't highlight for us. So I'm going to say rmrf get. So it should remove all the highlighting from our folder structure in Visual Studio Code, maybe make it a little easier to see. So what we want to do is we want to open up our source directory and our components directory. We do have a hello world.vu file in there. Let's go ahead and maybe rename that to something that makes a little more sense. Let's go ahead and change that to maybe block game, because it's, again, this is going to be very simple square game. So let's call it block game. We can update that as well in the app.vue file. So instead of saying hello world from components hello world, let's just go ahead and change all instances of hello world to now block game, and we're going to save it. We will come back to this app.vue file, so don't worry about that. But actually, you know what? Let's start stripping stuff out of this file to start. So for actually, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the style information. We're going to come back and add styles later. But for now, let's just remove everything. Inside of the template, let's go ahead and remove the message property because long term we won't have that. We also don't need this image. And finally, let's go ahead and maybe fix our tab indents. So let's go ahead and indent here. And it'll just make it a little easier to see long term. So let's go ahead and save that. So everything should be fine as of now inside of our app.vue file. It really doesn't add anything to our game. All we really did was clean stuff out from the default generator and changed everything to block game here. So now let's go into blockgame.vue. We're more or less going to do the same thing here because there's a lot of cruft code that's not really relevant to us. So let's wipe out a lot of the content inside of the template. We don't need this template class anymore. Let's go ahead and wipe out the style information. We'll leave the style tags, but we won't have any styles in them. And then let's go ahead and fix our indents. Oops. We don't need properties anymore. We removed them. We also name this as block game for the class name. Let's go ahead and indent these div tags, and we should be good to go. So there's nothing here. If I ran this, I would say npm run serve. It's going to start serving, and I'll open up in my web browser. So it's serving. So I have two applications serving now: the Node.js application and my other. But I'm going to say localhost 8080. And it's just a blank screen because we have nothing going on as of now. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code, and we're going to start adding our code, and then we're going to go back into our Node.js project little by little. So starting with this game file. So we want to create a canvas because this is going to be a 2D game. It technically could be a game. It's going to have all of the fundamentals of a game, but it's just not going to be competitive. So let's go ahead and add a canvas. We're going to give it a reference name. So we're going to say reference, or I mean ref. We're going to call it game. So in Vue, you can't just access the DOM components with query selectors. You have to use references. So hence this, we're just going to call it game. We're going to say the width is going to be, let's say 640. The height is going to be, let's say 480. And let me drop these to new lines so it's a little easier to see. But we're also going to give it some border information just so that way it's a little easier to see what the canvas is actually consisting of. So we're going to say style. We're going to say border. It's going to be 1px solid black. And we're going to say canvas. So this is our canvas component. It's going to be empty, but it's going to be what we use. So now inside of our script, we did import socket.io, or we actually did download it. We just need to import it. So we need to say import, we'll call it IO. We'll say from socket.io. This time it's going to be the client. So the client is included when we say the npm install. On the Node.js application, we just did the server. This time it's going to be the client. Inside of our class, we want to declare a few variables. So we're going to say data. We're going to say data returns. We're going to say data returns a few objects and variables. So we're going to say socket. So this is going to be our socket connection. It's basically just an initialization as of right now. This is how you initialize stuff in Vue. We're going to say socket. We're going to have a context. This is for our canvas. And we're going to have a position, so that way we just don't have a bunch of null data floating around. So the position, we're going to have a default X and a default Y, even though that it's kind of irrelevant what we're using there. So we have data. Now what we want to do is we have the option to now connect to our client or to our server, and then we have the option of listening for events, and then we have the option of issuing events. So first we need to establish a connection, and that's best done in the created lifecycle hook for Vue. So this is before the Vue renders. So we want to establish a connection. We defined our socket variable, so we can say this.socket equals, and we're going to say IO, and we're going to specify the host to our server. So we're going to say localhost port 3000. So this is in the created method. Now what we want to do is after the Vue renders, we want to start listening for events. So we want to work with our canvas. To do this, we should probably use the mounted lifecycle event. So this is after the Vue has rendered. We're going to say this.context. So this is, we're going to be working with our canvas now. We're going to say this.refs. So we're getting a reference to game because that's what we called it. And then we're going to say get context and 2D. So this is all HTML stuff as far as the get context stuff. I forgot my equal sign. But we're getting the reference. So it'd be similar to saying, you know what, we're doing a query selector to get the actual canvas, and then we're calling the get context method on that canvas. So same kind of stuff. All right, next step. Let's actually, what we can do is let's just render our component. So our actual block on the canvas, because if I saved it and if I went into my web browser, it probably, well, it has a canvas separated by a 1 pixel black border now. So it has nothing on it. So let's just draw our rectangle and we'll work our way up. So let's go ahead and say this dot context dot fill rect, so rectangle. Let's go ahead and say this dot position dot x, this dot position dot y. We'll specify the size of our block. Let's just say 20 pixels by 20 pixels. I'm going to save it. And let's go back into Google Chrome. We now have a small block at the corner of our screen. And this is using local data, so this is not coming from the server. But remember, after we establish a connection on line 27, the server is going to respond with a position. So let's go ahead and use that. So we're going to create a new line on line 31. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's go ahead and say this.socket. We're going to listen for messages. So we're going to say on, just like we did with the server. We're going to listen for the position message, because remember, if we go back into our app.js file, we are emitting a position. So that's what we're listening for. So position, let's go ahead and say, you know what, when we get the position, we have data now. What are we going to do with that data? Let's go ahead and use it for our rectangle. So I'm gonna move that into the listener now. So it's technically not going to render until we get a position back from the application. And this dot position is not going to change. So what we probably want to do is we want to say this dot position equals data and save that. So let's go ahead and go back into our browser now. You can see that the block has now moved. It's no longer in the corner because this is 200x, 200y. This is what our server says that the block should be at. So let's make a few more changes. Let's go ahead and go back into our code. We're going to be expecting the position to be coming in quite frequently. If we were to just update it like this with fill rectangle, it'd basically draw a line because it doesn't actually clear the canvas on every render. We have to do that manually. So let's go ahead and try doing that before we get too invested in the next step. So this is all part of the HTML canvas stuff. So we're going to say this.context dot clear rect. We're going to say 0, 0, and we're going to pass in the full size of our canvas. So we're going to say this.refs dot game dot width, and we're going to say this.refs dot game dot height. So that is going to clear the rectangle. So let's just leave it at that. We won't see anything from it from our HTML as of right now because we don't have any actual movement. Basically, what's happening is we're saying clear the canvas and then add a rectangle. So let's move on to the next step. So we actually want to move that box around. So what we can do is let's go ahead and go into, we want to create a method. So we're going to move outside of the mounted and outside of the created. We're going to create some methods, or in this case, one method. But we're going to say methods, and we're going to call it move. And move, we're going to specify a direction. So instead of saying, you know what, move it by 10 pixels, because we don't want the client to be able to determine that, we're going to say move in this direction and let the server tell us how far it's moved. So let's go ahead and say this.socket.emit, and we're gonna give the message a label. We're gonna call it move. So this is not position. This is called move, and we're gonna send the direction. So just like that. The server is not currently listening for move, but it will. But before we get there, let's go ahead and make use of this method by adding a series of buttons to our HTML. So we're going to add 4 buttons. We're not going to listen for keyboard commands, but we're going to say, let's go ahead and say in a new paragraph here, so that way it maybe formats itself a little better. Let's go ahead and say button. We're going to say v on. So this is we're going to say a click listener. We're going to say call this move function. We're going to pass in a direction. Let's call it right. And let's go ahead and in this case, we're going to call that button right and button. And we're going to do it a few more times, one for each direction. So left, we're going to say up, and we're going to say down. So left, up, down. So if I save it and if I went back into my web browser, now you can see that I do have some buttons here. I can click them. They're not going to do anything because the server is not expecting any move messages to come in from socket.io. So let's go back into our server now. Let's go into this app.js file, and let's start planning about listening for these. So we're going to say inside of the connection. So we're gonna listen for certain messages from this particular socket, but we're gonna say socket.on. We're gonna listen for move messages, and with the data, and that data is going to be left, right, up, etc. What we're going to do is we're going to do different events. So we're going to say switch. We're going to say data. We're going to say in the case of it's being left, we're going to say let's say position. Position.x, we're going to say minus it by 5 pixels. So we're going to say position equals position minus 5. So I just shortcutted it here with the minus equals sign. After we change the position, we're going to say socket.io.emit, and we're going to say position, and we're going to say position. Now you're probably wondering, why am I using socket.io rather than just socket up here? So socket.emit is going to emit to the just that one socket, so that particular client. Whereas socket.io emit, based on what we have on line 3, it's going to send it to all connected clients, because we want to update the position on all client machines, not just the one. So we're going to say break. I'm going to copy this a few more times. So I'm going to say right, up, down. So let's start changing that as well. So this is for right. Instead of minus 5, we're going to say plus 5. For up, let's go ahead and say that instead of x changing, it's going to be y. And then for down, we're going to say y is going to be plus 5, because of how it works on the XY grid. So basically, we're just moving stuff around. So let's go ahead and go back into our web browser. I'm going to refresh. Now I'm going to click these buttons. It actually does move the box. So this is where things are going to get interesting, because I'm going to open up another browser here. I'm going to navigate. I'm going to say localhost 8080. It's got 2 windows up here. Let's go ahead and try it out. So I'm going to say down. You can see that in both, it's moving it in both, because the server is telling each of the clients that are connected where that particular box should be. So this is a good example of using sockets. It's probably a better example than just doing the typical chat server that everyone does. because now we actually have a kind of game component to this, and we're using it as if it was a game server. So if we kind of relook at our code here, we have two core components. We have our app.js, which is where we are basically listening for client connections, and we're distributing changes to the position, which would ordinarily be part of a database. We have, let me just hide the Finder here. We have the blockgame.vue file, which is basically we're just rendering our canvas for our rectangles or whatever we want to draw on the screen. We have buttons, which could easily be keyboard events that call methods that emit messages to the server, and then the server responds with a new position. So not too complicated of things. So this is a great example of using sockets with Vue and Node.js.